Good morning, everyone. Welcome along to this lecture. My name is Derek Auchie, and I'm delighted to join you this morning. The subject of the talk today is presenting to persuade. How should it be done? And you should have on your screen the handout which I'm going to follow during this presentation, and it's split into 4 parts. I'm going to introduce what I'm going to say, and that will involve introducing myself at that point as well. I'm then secondly going to talk about the prevalence of persuasion. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the focus of persuasion, and then fourthly, I'm going to turn to discuss some points on the method of persuasion. So, the first of all, introduction. The first thing is why am I talking about this? Well, just a bit about my background. I was a lawyer in private practice, litigation, so court work, for a number of years before coming into academia. And in academia, I've been lucky enough to be able to teach the subjects which are of great interest to me. So I teach a bit of evidence and negotiation technique, mediation, dispute resolution generally. And my interest is really from a method point of view. So I'm interested in how disputes are resolved, not necessarily the substance of the law. And that, I think, comes from my background as a lawyer. More recently, I've been sitting on some tribunals, some Scottish tribunals for, I don't know, 15 years, I suppose. The first one when I started that career, and so that's exposed me to decision making and looking at how other lawyers present. And it was when I was delivering a class to some students on advocacy skills recently that I started to think about the connections between the different areas in which I have an interest. So negotiation technique, advocacy in particular, and it struck me that these things have in common one factor, which is that they involve persuasion. And I started to think about how do you persuade someone to do something. So it might be to give you something you want, to make a decision in your favor. It might be to let you have authority for something. Whatever it happens to be, whether it's in court or in another environment, often when we present, we are presenting in order to try and persuade. And so that got me thinking about the links between these different things, and that's what brought me to speak to you today. So that's kind of why, and hopefully that'll become a bit clearer as I go through the presentation. In terms of how, I'm going to split it into these 4 sections. So I'm going to really take you to some general points first of all, and then I'm going to narrow it down to some of the specifics and give you, I suppose, some advice or just some observations that I have on how people who are good at presenting to persuade manage to do it. So that's the why and the how. So that's the introduction. I'm moving on now to the second part, which is the prevalence of persuasion. And I've just used one word there, which is everywhere. What do I mean by that? Well, we all have to learn how to persuade people, and that's both in our professional lives and in our private lives. So when you are applying for a job, you're trying to persuade the person who's making the decision as to who should be recruited to recruit you. When you apply for a promotion or a pay rise, the same thing. When you are in an organization and you're making a pitch to perhaps win new business or to retain business, or indeed a pitch to your colleagues for authority or approval, or for a work on a project or whatever it happens to be, you are presenting to persuade. On the domestic front, when you're trying to persuade a partner, a spouse, a friend, a neighbour, whatever, to do something, I don't know, it could be about where you're going to go on holiday that year, or whether you're allowed to buy a particular car or some jewellery or whatever it happens to be, or talking to a neighbour about the place where your fence should go, or splitting the cost of common repairs, or whatever it happens to be, you are presenting to persuade. So we all need to do it. We all have to do it. Some of us have to do it quite a lot, and the success of our private and professional lives sometimes hinge on being able to do it well. So that's why I say it's everywhere. And it's in places where you don't really necessarily think that that's what you are doing. I'll come back to that point maybe a bit later. So that's the second point I wanted to make, is the prevalence of persuasion. It is a common thing. It's something that we have to do on a regular basis. The third area then I want to cover is the focus of persuasion. I'll talk a little bit more about this. How should you focus your efforts to persuade? Well, the principal focus should be on the person that you are trying to persuade. And that might sound a bit obvious, and quite a lot of what I'm going to say might sound a bit obvious, but I've got something to say about that later as well. Inherently, we are selfish. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, as a species, we are selfish. I think it's a survival thing, actually, although I don't want to stray into areas that I know nothing about. And there's quite a few of those, I can assure you. We are selfish, and therefore we tend to focus on ourselves. And we tend to think, well, what do I want to say to this person? But that's the wrong focus. I think the focus needs to be on the person who you're trying to persuade. And that is the reference point, I think, for everything that needs to be done in a good persuasive pitch. What does that person want to hear? What kind of things will they want me to talk about? Not what I want to talk about, but what do they want to hear? The second point there is focus on interest, and this is where I started to think about negotiation techniques, which we teach at the university here, and in fact we get the students to practice. And focusing on interest is of interest, and it's because when we, again, it's back to the same point, when we focus on let's say in a negotiation, we tend to focus on what we want. And we tend to focus on positions, and the research and literature on negotiation technique tells you not to focus on your position, not to focus on what you want, but to focus on why you want it, first of all, and then build up to what you want. So in other words, you start by giving the reasons, and then you build up to, and therefore because of these reasons, I want this. So focusing on your interests and then building up to the position, that's the negotiation technique. And I think that's about persuasion. Well, it is, because that's what you're doing when you're negotiating. You're trying to persuade someone to come to your point of view. But the really clever negotiator also focuses on the interests of the other party. So you empathize with where they're coming from. You talk about their interests. You talk about the things that are important to them, as well as the things that are important to you. And in doing so, you present yourself as reasonable, and if you're reasonable, you're more likely to persuade. People who are unreasonable tend not to be good at persuading. So I thought that's about persuasion, really. And that's a well-recognized, well-trodden path in negotiation theory and in the literature that's there. Have a look for it. You'll see lots of stuff, particularly in the US, about that. So it's a kind of subset of the first point, focusing on the person to be persuaded, focusing on their interests, what makes them tick, what do they want? What are they interested in? And focusing on that, at least in part, is more likely to make your presentation persuasive. And the third point comes from advocacy, really. When we teach advocacy skills at the university, and by that I mean the skills for lawyers who are going to appear in court, the number one message I always try and impart is make the decision maker's job easy. And everything that you do as a lawyer, has to be focused on that. Because if I'm the decision maker, I want an easy life. I want my job to be made easy. I don't want it to be difficult. I don't want it to be complicated. I don't want to have to work out what it is you're trying to argue or navigate my way through it. I just want you to present it on a silver platter, nice and easy. Make my job easy. If my job is easy, if you make my job easy when you try and persuade me, I'm more likely to be persuaded. If, however, someone else is trying to persuade me and they make my job difficult or more difficult, then that's less likely to have the desired impact. So making the decision maker's job easy is crucial, I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we come into the fourth topic. So the focus of persuasion is the general sort of high line, if you like, of your concentration point, which is that you're thinking about the person that you're trying to persuade. It may sound obvious, and I bet you it does sound obvious to all of you, but actually it's not instinctive. And I think that's the problem here, and I'll come back to that a wee bit later. So that's what I want to say about the focus of persuasion. I want to spend most of my time, however, talking about the method of persuasion. So that's the fourth and the second last heading. I'm going to conclude after that. So how do you do it? So I've talked a lot about the general approach. What I'm going to talk now about is the specifics of how I think it might be done. And these are just my ideas. You may have your own ideas, and obviously you may challenge some of what I say, and that's fine as well. But these are my thoughts, and these are my thoughts from my career in advocacy when I was a lawyer and trying to persuade judges to give me what I wanted, to decide the case in my favour. It comes from teaching and looking at methodology of persuasion and mediation, negotiation in particular, and it comes from my judicative career, if you like, which is making decisions, and where lawyers have been trying to persuade me to make decisions in their favour, or at least parties, not necessarily lawyers. And so it's those three reference points that then bring me to some of these more specific tips, if you like. So I mentioned a number of things. Preparation is key. I mean, there is no way on earth that you're going to be able to wing it. Nobody can. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how talented you think you are. It doesn't matter how brilliant you think you are. You will not be able to wing it. And it's absolutely obvious, and I see this on occasion, it's absolutely obvious when someone is presenting an argument that they have not prepared. It just is. It's just obvious, and it's not good. So preparation is key, and you need to, and you can't prepare enough, or you can't over prepare is what I mean to say. You can't over prepare. So make sure that you dedicate enough time to that, including practice. So ideally, what you want to do is practice your presentation and practice it in the environment in which you're going to present, whether that's online or not. I'll say something about that a bit later as well. And practice it to someone so that they can give you feedback. And that depends. This depends on the time that you have and the importance of the presentation. But if it's important and you have the time, then practicing it is useful. And getting feedback on that. But preparation is absolutely key, and there is no substitute for it, I'm afraid. And it's a bit of a pain, really, because preparation takes time. And wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just deliver an important presentation without having prepared it? But I'm afraid that you don't have that luxury. Well, you do, but you don't have it. You can't afford it if you want to be successful in your attempt to persuade. Identify the points that you want to make. So think about, what do I want to say? And in fact, what do I need to say really is what you should ask yourself. And identify those points and build your presentation around those points. Don't be tempted to do something chronological unless there's some special reason for that being suitable. You know, so if you're talking about your career, for example, in a jobs pitch, there's nothing worse than hearing someone go back over their CV. You know, talk not about when you've done things, but what you've done, because usually when you've done stuff doesn't really matter because you've done it. That's all that matters. So think about, what are the points that I want to make, and just focus on those points and have a sort of reasonably small number of points and build your presentation around that. That's how I would do it. Simplicity is my next point. There's nothing better in presentation terms, in terms of content, than content that's simple. Lawyers are terrible at this sometimes, and so are other professionals, medical professionals and others. The temptation is to make something sound complicated so that it sounds impressive. Well, it's the reverse, I'm afraid. The simpler that you express something, the better. I remember reading a judgment by Lord Neuberger, who used to be the president of the Supreme Court in the UK. He's now retired. And look at some of his speeches online, incidentally, some of the presentations he's done, which are, you know, if he does a speech to a group, he'll usually, the speech is published. But what I'm referring to here is a judgment in a very complicated case, very technical legal question about prescription and limitation, which if anybody is legally qualified, you'll know it's not a very exciting area of the law, but it's about the length of time that you can afford to wait before you raise a court action. There are time limits. And there was a change. There was a Supreme Court case in which Lord Neuberger sat, and there was a very technical point about interpretation of a provision of the law, and he explained it so simply that I honestly believe that it might have been able to be understood by someone without legal qualifications. And I just read the judgment of another judge in the same case, and then it came to his judgment, and he very nonchalantly said, Lord Reed has just explained the law in some detail. Lord Reed's now the president of the Supreme Court. I'll just add a few comments, he says very modestly, but then proceeds to give a judgment which was absolutely crystal clear and was explained almost in layman's terms. Now, this is the top judge in the country on a very technical point, and he could afford to explain it in a complicated legal jargony sense, but he chose not to. So that inspired me to think, state points simply. Pace is the next point, and therefore content. And I'm just looking at pace myself and thinking I'm running out of time. Here's the problem. If you try and include too much, as I've done here, then what you do is you end up having to speed up. What you need to do is think about how much you really need to include. Don't sacrifice content for pace. If you have to take something out to mean that you can fit in what you're saying in the time limit that you've got, then do it. It's very difficult to do that because you don't want to really sacrifice the content, but really think about what you have to say. Also, try and reduce what you say by just saying it more concisely. So don't necessarily take out points that and reduce your presentation by reducing the content, but just reduce the words that you use to say it. If you think about a document and doing it to a word limit, I always find if you go back over a document and try and reduce it by just reducing the language, changing the sentences, taking out part of what you've said on a point but leaving the point in, you can reduce an awful lot of words by just doing that. Well, the same is the case if it's an oral presentation. Structure is important. I've tried to do that with you this morning. So I've said up front what I'm going to talk about. I'm signposting, I'm telling you when I'm moving on to the next topic. It's important because it makes it far easier to follow. You're making the job of the decision maker easy. Courtesy, always be courteous, even when others are not being courteous to you. So sometimes you might be asked aggressive questions, or someone might be rude to you when you're presenting or at the end of a presentation. Just don't rise to it. Be courteous in return. That's very difficult to do, of course, for obvious reasons. But that's something which is always something to look out for. Humor, don't do it unless you really feel you have to, and certainly don't pre-plan it, because pre-planned humor, in my experience, normally doesn't work. I don't know why this is, but in my experience, both from my own experience and from seeing others trying it, if something is spontaneous, somehow it's more likely to be funny. I don't understand why that is. Maybe psychologists could talk about that. But it seems to me that pre-planned humor normally doesn't work. And humor is such a fickle thing. Some people don't have a sense of humor. People's sense of humor is different. People sometimes don't like other people who are humorous. They like their own humor, but not yours. And some people think humor is inappropriate. And you're never going to, unless you really know your audience, you're never really going to know what they're going to think about that. So it's very, very difficult area. In online presentations, which we're all having to do, of course, now, and I'm doing one now, we're all having to learn different tips. I just have a few things to say about online presentations. Microphone, I hope you're hearing me clearly. I've got a headset here. I've been using that for a while now. I think computer microphones can sometimes be a bit dodgy. And so a headset is always worth thinking about. It's a bit of a clutter, of course, but it's worth thinking about. You can get ones that are less obvious than this one with its red cable, which is maybe not the best idea. A neutral background, I hope I've got one of those. I'm in a cabin in my garden, and it's the garden behind me. But don't have books behind you. Don't have nice pictures, because we all know what we do in the news. When we see someone with books, we say, oh, look, I've got that book. Oh, look at that wallpaper. Isn't it awful? It's distracting. And if you're trying to persuade someone with what you're saying and how you're saying it, then if they're talking about what's behind you, that's not likely to work. Interruptions, try and avoid them. Tell people you're in a presentation. Tell people not to come into the background. If my wife now walks past here with the dog, then I'll just be, housed by my own petard, I think is the phrase. But make sure you don't get interruptions. That includes emails popping on the screen. Your emails need to be off. Your phone. Just take some time to think, how might I be interrupted, and remove the source of it. Take time to connect yourself and get ready. I did that this morning. I was quite early on because I know technical problems can happen and you need time to sort them out. You don't want to be late for your presentation because you've got the technical problem when your audience, the decision makers, have their IT all ready. And practicing online with someone on the other end is a good idea because, again, that can highlight sound issues and other things. So there's particular things that will be features of online presentations that perhaps don't apply elsewhere. So those are some of the points, the method, and all of those I think involve thinking about the focus. So the points under heading 4 there, I think, feed back into the focus of the present. I hope they do, at least. When you're thinking about the person to be persuaded, their interests, and making their job easy. So the conclusion, common sense. I'm often told when I teach these things, particularly, for example, in negotiation, this is all just common sense. Well, it is, but I find that common sense is actually not that common, in the sense that it all makes sense, I hope. And I hope I haven't said anything that makes you think, oh, I just totally disagree with that. So hopefully it makes sense, but that doesn't mean to say you'll do it. And the point I want to leave you with is this. In order to present in a way that's persuasive, you need to make an effort. And I don't mean make an effort in preparing your slides or your presentation. I mean make an effort in how you present, and think about how you present, and do something about it. If you think, well, actually, I'm weak on this, or I don't do that, and think about it and put effort into it, because it's not instinctive. In fact, a lot of the stuff that makes for a good presentation is counterintuitive, and therefore you might say that it's common sense, but in fact it's something which requires a degree of effort. So I've gone over on time, which is one of the things I said I was talking about earlier. It's 23 minutes there I've taken, so apologies for that, but I think now there might be some questions, and I'm happy to take any questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. I think, Fiona, you might have some questions.
Thank you, Derek. I found that really helpful myself, actually. We don't have any questions at the moment. If anybody would like to send them in, we'll give you a couple of minutes to ask your questions. I thought personally it was really helpful that you put in the part about online, because I think that's something new and challenging that not everybody has not everybody's used to that, and we're all having to adjust at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's that it's so much. There is so much to think about, and you're right. I mean, everybody's had to switch to that. The extent to which we'll require to still present on so much online in future remains to be seen. Of course, will we just revert back to the old way, or will there be an element of a vestige, if you like, of online? I don't know. I suspect there will be. And even when you look at the courts, for example, they have really embraced online hearings and had to do that. And I suspect there'll be some courts and some cases that will not be heard in person again, or case types. And so, we might see quite a sea change in how business is done.